initiated by International Refugee Rights Association. This is Gizem, and today we are going to host İrfan Tatlı to talk about the issue of migration in African countries. To introduce him briefly, İrfan Tatlı graduated from the Department of Political Science and currently works as a researcher at the IHH Humanitarian Aid Foundation. In addition, he conducts studies on migration and field studies in various migration regions such as Syria, Afghanistan, South Asia, and African countries. Hello, Mr. Tatlı.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us today.
I also thank you for your invitation.
With your permission, I would like to start with the first question.
Yeah, sure.
What can we say about the general characteristics of migration movements in African countries? So, the continent on the move or contained?
First of all, I should be clarified that migration is a very ancient phenomenon for all humanity. Humankind has always been in a migration movement throughout history. In the African continent, there have been many migration movements for various reasons in almost each period of history. The migration movements that we will talk about today's podcast are mostly about the migrations that took place in the last decade in Africa. As for the question, today more than 30 million internally displaced refugees and asylum seekers in Africa. And this number is representing almost one-third of the world's total refugee population. In the last year, Africa continent witnessed the most new internal displacements as conflict and violence have been flaring in several countries across the continent. Millions of new displacements were recorded in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Somalia, Nigeria, and it triggered by increasing insecurity, instability, natural disasters, and human rights violations.
Well, secondly, what is the current status of migration movements in the continent?
Number of documented migrants within and from the African region has nearly doubled since 2010, and it means that the number is continuing a two-decade trend of expansion. African migration is being driven by a varied combination of push-pull factors for each country. Primary push factors are conflict, repressive governance, and limited economic opportunities. And 9 of the top 15 African countries of origin for migrants are in conflict now. So we can say that there are various reasons for the migration movements that took place in Africa in the last century. The main reasons are insecurity caused by conflict, civil wars and terrorism, political and economic instability, unemployment, famine and drought caused by climate change. Thus, migration movements caused by all these reasons take place in different types and directions. In general terms, migration movements of Africa can be considered as the migration movements within the continent and the migration movement outside the continent. Movements within the continent can be counted as migrations within the country, like in Ethiopia, Tigray region, and migrations between countries in the continent, like from South Sudan to Uganda. Migration movements out of the continent generally take place through North African countries, as they are mostly directed towards Europe. There are also different migration movements towards the Middle East and North America.
Well, now I would like to ask, what are the regions where immigration is the most intense and what are the main reasons for people to migrate?
When we look at the causes of migration in Africa, 4 main factors stand out: climate change, political instability due to the conflict, increasing act of terrorism and violence, and poverty. And then, as I just mentioned, we can talk about 2 main migrations for Africa. The first is the migrations within the continent. These migrations can take place between countries in the continent as well as in the form of migration of people within a country. Such migration movements generally take place due to the civil wars and conflicts or due to the natural disasters. For example, due to the civil wars in South Sudan, 2.4 million South Sudanese immigrated to neighboring countries such as Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Sudan. Also, tens of thousands of people living in the region migrated to Sudan due to the conflicts that started in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, while approximately 4.5 million people were internally displaced within Ethiopia. An example of forced migration due to the violence and conflict is Central African refugees. Nearly 1 million people fled the violence in Central African Republic and migrate to the neighboring countries such as Cameroon, Chad, and Democratic Republic of Congo. Also, an example of migration movements due to the natural disaster is Somalia. Due to the drought in Somalia, millions of Somalis had to migrate within Somalia, while millions of them sought refuge in neighboring countries. The second type of migration in Africa is migration movements out of the continent, so out of the Africa. Main motivations and reasons for these migration movements may be different. These migration waves can be characterized as voluntary migration rather than forced migration. So these migrations take place from countries such as Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia to the countries such as Italy, France, Spain, and Malta, and so it spreads all over Europe. For this migration route, main motivations or main pull factors that influence the migration decision making are geographical proximity, established diaspora, and economic opportunity. However, it should be mentioned that some of the refugees and migrants who tried to cross Europe on this dangerous migration route with small and unsafe boats lost their lives. But still, despite all these painful, annoying experiences, tens of thousands of people continue to take this risk. So it is like gambling with your life. Around 21 million documented Africans live in another African country, a figure that is likely an undercount given that many African countries do not track migration. Among African migrants who have moved off the continent, some 11 million live in Europe, almost 5 million in the Middle East, and more than 3 million in the Northern America. In other words, it seems possible to make generalization that while reasons such as conflict and natural disasters cause migration movements within the continent in Africa, economic reasons and political reasons cause overseas migration from Africa to Europe, Middle East, and even Northern America. However, it should also emphasize that it is not sufficient or associate a migration movement with a single cause. For a competent analysis, problems need to be considered in all their aspects. In this context, it is not correct to attribute the migration movements in Africa to a single cause. Although there is always a main or dominant reason, people migrate due to the conditions created by many reasons. For example, Lake Chad shrank by 95%. The control by the region by Boko Haram is another dimension of the crisis. So the decade-long Boko Haram revolt in Nigeria caused and continues to be widespread insecurity and displacement in the Lake Chad basin. So the reason for people to migrate in the countries like Chad and Nigeria are due to the multiple problems such as conflict and natural disasters.
Then what would you say about the problems related to migration movements?
There are many problems caused by migration in Africa. These problems can arise in economic, political, cultural, or social fields. However, life safety, which is accepted as the first and most fundamental human right, ranks first among all these problems. There are two main problems caused by migration movements in Africa, whether within the continent or out of the continent. First, the number of people who lost their lives while trying to immigrate to Europe is quite high. It is estimated that the number of people who lost their lives in the Mediterranean while trying to immigrate to Europe since 2014 has exceeded 17,000. So, on the other hand, it is predicted that the number of deaths in migrations within the continent is much higher. The second point to emphasize is the extent of human smuggling during these migration movements. Migration movements emerging in the region have become an important market for human smugglers. It is estimated that there is an average annual cash volume of $765 million on the trans-Saharan migration route alone. In addition, the fact that the activities of international non-governmental organizations and humanitarian organizations in the African continent are quite inadequate, that the humanitarian aid activities for the region are carried out as one-time aids and not sustainable despite the attractive campaigns, are a problem for the humanitarian crisis in Africa. So I should also emphasize that it is my personal opinion.
Okay, then what is your future projection for migration movements in the continent?
It is seen that the phenomenon of migration will continue to exist as one of the main agenda topics in African continent. So it is expected that there will be a significant increase in the number of worker migration in Africa. In addition to the fact that the conflicts, violent movements, and acts of terrorism in Africa don't seem to end in the near future, unfortunately, it's a bitter truth that the negative effects of climate change on the continent will increasingly continue. Moreover, the continental countries unfortunately don't have the capabilities and capacities to deal with these problems alone. For these reasons, the humanitarian problems that cause migration, especially in the African context, are a serious issue that should be addressed with the action initiatives of many states, especially regional states and superstate or non-state international institutions.
Well, thank you for all the responses. It was a pleasure to have you. Is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I also add something. Maybe I should have said this at the beginning, but as a last word, I would like to add that Africa is not a country. Therefore, it is necessary to act according to this fundamental reality when analyzing the problems in African continent, including migration, or in the process of finding solutions to these problems. Migration is a fact of the entire African continent, but this reality is based on different reasons according to the characteristic of the countries in the continent and may have different results. So I hope this situation will be taken into account in future studies about the continent.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you so much for you.
Dear listeners, here is the end of today's episode. This is Gizem and İrfan Tatlı. Today, we talked about the question of migration in African countries. Thanks for listening. See you next time in Roads to Migrate.